Hello everyone, it's Sasha once again. We are continuing with the contact series, and there is something today that we wish to discuss that we know has been confusing for many of you. It has to do with contact and the time continuum. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's start by talking about a common question that we are asked. For example, Sasha, do you know Semjase? Semjase was a very famous Pleiadian contact from the Billy Meier contacts of the 1970s. So somehow there is kind of a humorous understanding that we Pleiadians all know each other. And when we answer that question, sometimes people are very surprised. The way we answer the question is that to us, that being you know of as Semjase is from our historical past. So we are not, in a sense, residing in the same time space as that being at that time. So that is one example of perhaps some of the confusion that can happen regarding contact. Let us explain what we mean. If you look at some of the very old contact literature, for instance, from the 1950s, you will see that there is a certain style of contact, meaning that the beings primarily are human type, sometimes even Nordic type, and they dress a certain way, they act a certain way, they speak a certain way, and the philosophy they discuss is very, very common. Now, the question is that a true reflection of the extraterrestrial community, or what is influencing that? Because if you look, for example, through time, from the 1950s to the current day, you can see that the nature of the extraterrestrial contacts began to change. So you began to have contacts with other species. You began to have contacts that were not so, let's say, human-like, but had instead high strangeness to them. So if you look then at the difference between those 1950s contacts, the contacts in the 70s with the Pleiadians and Billy Meier, you look at then the contacts in the 80s and the 90s with Whitley Strieber as an example, and the Zeta Reticuli. You look then now in current day at the kind of contacts that are being expressed in many contact groups. They are no longer conforming to a human version of the understanding of what contact is. They are a little bit more out of the box these days. So what is the factor that contributes to the type of contact a person or people will receive? So this brings us then to the idea of the time continuum, or time space. Now, we are not going to get into heavy physics or anything here. We are simply going to give you some metaphors to help you understand the idea. So, we have a whiteboard here, and let's say this is you here in the present time, and the you here feels fixed, so to speak, in a time continuum. So it's very, very hard for humans right now to understand what it's like to experience fluid time. The closest example that we could give to you, and it's not really a very good example, but maybe it will get the point across, is that on your planet you have many time zones. So for example, it appears from the point of view of America that people in Asia are in the future, so to speak. Because while it is today here, it is tomorrow in Asia, so to speak. Yet, this does not create a conundrum or a paradox in your mind. You understand this idea that there is a present moment now, and the delineations of time are secondary to the present moment as it is. So contact actually we can extrapolate that idea to contact in the following way. First of all, the threads of contact, or who you call in, who you are connected with, is very much based on frequency. So we're going to draw here. You see there's some little stars there on the whiteboard above the human, and those are representing different potential consciousnesses that this human person could connect to. And you can see that they're not categorized in years or time boxes, so to speak. These consciousnesses that all exist as potentials for you to connect with, it doesn't matter what time frame you would judge them to be in, because the attraction between you has nothing to do with time continuum. So basically you will pull in the contact or the consciousness that is appropriate or necessary for you to have contact with at that time. So a lot of this then has to do with the human person and what they might be experiencing in their evolution and what they might need to experience, or what kind of fears, for example, they might need to work through. They will pull in a contact that will reflect what is their highest good, and sometimes that highest good might be scary. Because it's scary doesn't mean it's not the highest good. Often the fear is a distortion of the actual experience, but it is there to help you move through. For example, the pain and fear band, which we've talked about in previous videos regarding the quantum map. Okay, so let's go back then to the 50s. And we would say, collectively speaking, what humanity needed to pull in at that time was a way to look at itself in relationship to the universe. So at that time, especially during the communistic scare and the scare about others that are different from you, the beings that you pulled in as a way to move yourself to the next level of your evolution were primarily white, were primarily Nordic looking or human looking, who could pass on the street, so to speak, for humans. This was a first step to help humans become more comfortable with the idea of extraterrestrial contact. However, as the initial contacts, especially in the 1950s, were handled between humans and sometimes government officials, sometimes just between human and ET singularly, or groups, or government, or civilian, is what we mean to say. It began to be known by the extraterrestrial community that humans could only really see contact through the lens of their human understanding. So it was all about warfare and security and hierarchy and things such as that. So that was the type of contact primarily pulled in. Now there were a lot of other contactees, if you will, in the 50s. If you look at the famous person on your world called George Van Tassel as an example, these types of humans were, let's say, more of the cutting edge consciousness type, who were pulling in slightly higher in frequency, more expansive ET contact that could help propel the human species into a more expanded state of consciousness. But even then, those channels or contactees at that time would only receive what could be assimilated by the collective and also by the individual. So you fast forward, for example, you go into the 70s and you look at the contacts that were happening then. Billy Meyer, of course, an example. They are a little bit, again, more edging you toward the idea of expanded consciousness, getting you to begin to understand realities that are outside the box of the human reality. But also toward the late 70s and into the 80s, you started to pull in contacts that had to do with a lot of fear. And we have to say, you know, we've said this a million times already, but we're going to say it again. Just because there is fear, just because the being appears scary, does not mean it is negative. So those contacts that generated a lot of fear in the 70s, 80s, 90s were being pulled in as a way to really accelerate your evolution and move you through the deep polarization that was possible that you would experience. Now, if you look at your world now in 2021, and you see the polarization that's happening on your world, maybe you might say, well, Sasha, it didn't work. However, the other timelines in which you did not give yourself permission, let's say, to be exposed to the refinement of your fear of polarity and your fear of other, your planet would be actually a lot more polarized now. So these contacts really helped you begin the integration process and understanding yourself as a fractal of the hologram of consciousness, which is something that we have already spoken about in other videos. So now we go past the 90s, which we would say the 90s was really the culmination of, in terms of numbers, the amount of people having deeply fearful experiences. After the turn of the century into the 2000s, while some people are having fearful experiences, they're actually very less. And the reason for that is because collectively you've done a lot of processing of the shadow within yourself. Although, yes, we hear you, there's more still to go. But you've begun to turn the corner because your consciousness has begun to be a little bit more malleable, a little bit more flexible, fluid, and you're beginning now to pull in contact that has to do, maybe that is actually less physical, with collective beings or with other types of consciousness that are highly evolved, of a very high frequency. And now those types of consciousnesses are very hard to define. And if you're doing contact work, for example, they can be very hard to put in a box, so to speak. So your contact work, your contact experiences might become stranger and stranger. But that's okay, because there is an integration process happening where these very highly refined consciousnesses that you're working with now are helping to shatter or break the fixed structures of your reality in such a way that you can open yourself to more expansive states of consciousness and begin to tap into the fractal nature of the hologram that you are, expressing itself in many ways. So in current time now, many of the contacts you are having are with other aspects of you directly. Now we know ultimately everything is all an aspect of the one, but it's like layers of an onion. all the way back to the one, so to speak. Now you are very, very directly making contact with beings who you might label them future selves, but that's a very, very limiting label. Yet we understand it's one that humans understand. So you are making contact then with these other aspects of you, other expressions of you. Think of it like a radio. Where there are many, many, many stations, and you can listen to country, you can listen to rock, you can listen to classical. They all have their purpose, but they are uniquely different. And now you are able to begin to pull in more and more refined frequencies that you were not able to pull in before because there was so much stuff in the way. When we say stuff in the way, what we mean by that is your own fears, your own unhealed stuff, your own wounds, and your own rigid points of view about good guys and bad guys. That especially is beginning to change, and actually it has to change. Because as you go into these higher levels, which you are now beginning to do, as the fractals move closer to the one of the hologram, you will find there are no good guys, there are no bad guys. There is simply consciousness in all its myriad expressions. It's only consciousness. And that's when the shadow within becomes healed. So we have kind of gone off a little bit on a tangent here, but we wanted you to understand how in such a very short period of time on your world, you have transitioned from human type contact that was very fixed and very rigid into very, very fluid and expansive consciousness contacts that are leading you back to the hologram of your true nature. It's only been 60 years? No, maybe more than that, 70 years, 80 years. As species evolution goes, that's a very, very short time for the evolution of consciousness, and you have made it in leaps and bounds. Therefore, we would say to continue your work, continue your reaching out, and especially continue the idea of moving away from labeling bad and good. Because those stories that you hear out there of these ETs have a bad agenda and these have a good agenda, they are energy you're pulling in that's reflecting your state of consciousness. As you evolve, as you heal your shadow within, as you integrate your poles within, that type of experience no longer is seen and no longer is embraced and begins to fade away into the background. So we hope we have given you something to think about today. We could probably go on, but that's enough to chew on. We suspect you might have to listen to this again and chew on it a little more. But more than chew on it with your brain, we would say, feel what we are saying. Feel the continuum of consciousness in all its many frequencies, and that is going to help you understand the nature of contact from the next level of understanding. Thank you so very much, and we send you much love.